SK Telecom suffered a major leak of customer data following a cyber attack last month. We cover this security breach as well as broader safety concerns on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It's Thursday, May 1st. I'm Min Sunhee. It's Labor Day here in South Korea, and today we touch upon a number of news stories related to the corporate arena and more. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, as always, it's good to have you here.
Happy to be back. Thanks.
I also have Marc Kyuha Baek, an attorney for Labor at Jipyong LLC. Marc, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hello, thank you for having me again.
Right, we will start here in the studio. Kelly, let's begin with details about the data breach at SK Telecom as covered by the international media.
For those who are outside of South Korea, one of the big conglomerates that is often talked about as a major player in the Korean economy is SK Group. So SKT, as we call it, SK Telecom, that's a part of the conglomerate. And so what happened this past week, it did make international news, but it's largely a domestic issue here, is that SKT had a data breach, if you will. They were essentially hacked. I think they said that there was basically malware discovered in its database that manages mobile user identities and network authentication. So while it's not clear what exactly has been exposed, it's been a major concern here in terms of people wondering if their personal data could be compromised or used against them. And one thing that I found surprising in this news story, and I didn't know, is that SKT actually has 25 million subscribers, according to Korean media. That's about half of the South Korean population. I had no idea that this company was that widespread and that powerful. So when you're talking about potentially all of their users having their data exposed in any capacity, it's seriously concerning. So what's been happening is SKT first came out and said, if you come to our stores, we'll replace your SIM card. And that what happened was there were queues outside of the stores for days and days on end. People were very upset. I think some 280,000, the last I checked, customers actually unsubscribed or terminated their contracts. And so the company came back and said, we will also for free give you a way to switch to the eSIM. And what we're now seeing is that some people, especially older customers, are struggling with that. And I know for me, I looked at the website with the directions on how to switch to an eSIM, and it wasn't that simple. So we're kind of seeing South Korea, one of the most highly wired countries in the world, one of the highest smartphone user penetration rate countries in the world, dealing with a major data security concern, and then kind of this tizzy of how do I switch my SIM card over, and if I wait a long time or if it's not available to me, what does that mean? And I don't necessarily have the answers to that, but I know that, like, for instance, within our company, we have been advised to switch if we are customers, and it's something that has touched many of us personally as well. The other interesting part of this is it's not clear who's behind the attack. I don't want to speculate. Often in foreign media, North Korea is talked about as a major player in cyber attack attempts against South Korea, but at this time we just really don't know. But certainly it's not a good look for the company. And it's not a good look in terms of data security in South Korea. I believe the government actually asked for a probe into its general procedures in terms of data protection for this reason.
Right. Now, as you mentioned, SK Telecom has begun SIM card replacement in response to this data leak. But for some reason, this particular response measure, it's also triggered quite a bit of concerns about SIM swap scams. For those of our viewers who are not familiar with this, could you tell us what a SIM swap scam is and why is it being linked to this latest data breach?
Yeah, so total disclaimer, I am not a tech reporter in my current position. Sure. I was a tech reporter for like a year at Mic.com, and I've touched cybersecurity a little bit in relation to North Korea, but I'm not an expert on this topic. I have to read into this a little bit, but I will share what I've found for those who haven't taken the time. So SIM swapping apparently is a very common form of social engineering related hacking. It's also called SIM splitting or SIM jacking from what I've read. it does sound like this is a bit different from what happened to SKT, because basically what happened to SKT is a wide-scale breach where there was a hacking scandal and people were worried about their data being exposed because of the particular database where the malicious code was found. Whereas when we talk about SIM jacking or SIM swapping, we're talking about more of a user-to-user based hacking issue where basically individuals are targeted. There are social engineering tactics, which kind of mean like ways that are meant to trick you to accidentally click on something or partake in giving up your own data. And so there are certain precautions that you can take as a person. I really recommend that people read online about these things because, I mean, it's very common. We talk about phone phishing scandals, for instance, and there's more awareness about that now, but I think there's less about SIM swapping. And SIM swapping is one of the reasons why you'll often hear advice like you should have Google Authenticator, that you should, a lot of people have two-factor authentication related to their phone number. But because of SIM swapping, now a lot of people are advising you should actually have an extra step of authentication where it's not just a text message to your phone number. It should also be like a code on an authenticator app or some kind of Face ID or something because of these scandals. And so by definition, it's whenever an unauthorized SIM change happens without the customer's consent. So it's usually when a phone number is transferred to another user without that person knowing about it or agreeing to it. Often the person is tricked into being a part of that. The reason why it's concerning is that this allows the hacker or the criminal to intercept the customer's phone calls and text messages to receive one-time security codes. So if you can imagine, that could mean potentially that someone could get into your bank account, could get into your stocks, if you hold your passwords in a centralized app like LastPass or something like that, that would be serious if they were able to enter that way. Social media. So you're talking about someone could actually take your money or your identity or pose as you to contact your family and take advantage. Say, you have a grandmother who thinks it's you contacting them and they're able to get into their bank account. I mean, these things do happen. And so just a last thing I want to say about this. I think for those who haven't heard about it, it makes total sense. The reason why this news story is bringing us to this is because people are now aware that having a SIM card in their phone could mean that, in a hacking breach like this, that you want to change your SIMs to protect yourself. So we're talking about SIM cards, generally speaking. That's the connection here. But the other thing is, this is a growing tactic. We've heard more and more about voice phishing or AI taking over, like kind of simulating people's voices and tricking us that way. But according to FBI statistics, basically between 2018 and 2020, roughly, they received 320 complaints in their subsidiary bureau that deals with these kinds of things about this kind of tactic, SIM swapping, and the adjusted losses were about 12 million. So that was a couple of years ago. But in 2021, so shortly after, they received 1,611 such reports with an adjusted loss of 68 million. So we're talking about end of 2018 to 2020 versus 2021, an exponential increase in material losses as well as reports of this. And I can imagine that there are a lot of people not reporting these things because they don't even know it's happening to them.
Right, which is why, Kelly, as you mentioned, it would be a good idea to actually read up on all this then.
Yeah.
In the meantime, Mark, back to the security breach at SK Telecom. There is talk about this company looking ahead at legal battles amid its customer data breach, of course. What look to be the points of contention at court? Mark?
So we see two dimensions of litigation in this matter, the government and the customers. The Personal Information Protection Act lays out detailed protection measures that needs to be taken by the personal information controller, in this case, SK Telecom, a company who receives and manages the personal information from the customer. If it is found that SKT did not fulfill the requirements by the law, then the government can order a administrative and a penalty fine. Through recent revisions to the law, now it is possible for the government to order a penalty fine up to 3% of the overall sales of the company, which is huge. We saw numerous personal information leak cases in the past, And in 2023, LJU Plus was ordered to pay 6.8 billion won for the personal information leak of 300,000 customer records from its additional services server. This time, the fines could be much higher because of the scale of the accident and also because of the recent revisions that raised the security level for the personal information controllers. Upon the order of the government or the Personal Information Protection Commission, the SKT may file a lawsuit at the administrative court against the government, arguing that the penalty amount is too much. So the discussion will be on whether SK Telecom fulfilled the statutory requirements under the PIPA. And the other dimension is the litigation between SKT and its customers around compensation for damages. The PIPA says that the data subject, a customer, can claim a compensation for damages against the personal information controller. The law also has a punitive damage clause where the court can order punitive compensation within 5 times the damage suffered by the data subject. The law also has a statutory compensation for damages where a data subject can be awarded with compensation for the fact that their personal information was leaked without actually proving the damages. But if you look at the past accidents where the large amount of personal information was leaked, monetary or material damages were not easily recognized by the court because it was very difficult for the customers to show or prove that they got actual monetary damages because of the leak. So in the past instances, customers rather claimed the compensation for mental suffering damages, or 위자료 in Korean. It's much easier to get compensation by this approach, but then amount is very limited in usual cases. In the past, normally around 100,000 won to 300,000 won, so in US dollars, around $70 or $200 per person were awarded for the compensation for mental suffering. But this time, we cannot really forecast how the litigation will turn out, again, because of the sheer magnitude of the accident, and it is the first kind in the data privacy cases. Also, the required level of the personal information protection has been raised over the years, so it will take a lot of efforts for the SKT to prove that they've done enough under the reasonable standards and the statutory standards given by the PIPA.
Right, I see. Especially since it has, like as you mentioned earlier, 25 million subscribers here in the country. Kelly, staying with broader concerns over user data, China's DeepSeek, it's available again here in South Korea for downloading after an almost, I believe, 2-month suspension. Now, authorities here in the country claim DeepSeek unilaterally sent user information and prompts to third parties in China during its availability here in early January. What are pundits saying, Kelly, about safe use with regard to this particular app?
Well, they're saying a lot, and this is because this is kind of a new frontier in terms of an issue that we're dealing with globally. We are more wired than ever. You know, there are several countries now that are major technological players in the landscape, whereas this was kind of seen as a Silicon Valley dominated front during the dot-com boom and, you know, the beginning of Facebook and all these social media apps. Now we're seeing that people are using things like TikTok or, you know, French apps and things like that. So what we're dealing with is it's an increasingly crowded market of apps and major app companies being used by an international portfolio of users. And then you put in things like foreign policy and geopolitics and, you know, in the case of South Korea and China or China and the United States, you know, tinges of an adversarial relationship where there's suspicion there. And so what happened is, if we look back in February, essentially DeepSeek acknowledged that in some way, shape, or form, they were not paying attention to or fully following the data protection rules that are in place by South Korea's government agency that oversees that. So it was suspended from the App Store. And then this past month, it was revealed that DeepSeek did transfer user information and prompts without those users' permission. What this really means for the average user of DeepSeek in South Korea, I don't think we really know. And this kind of reminds me of what has been going on with TikTok in the United States. There's a lot of suspicion with TikTok that it could potentially someday be a situation where the Chinese government, because of its more authoritarian nature, compels the company to give up user data. There's certainly been claims that, you know, ideological warfare, if you will, is being used on a state level on apps like TikTok. And so, I mean, I think those fears are founded because we are dealing with, like I said, somewhat adversarial geopolitical relationships. We have seen foreign governments interfere with things like elections by trying to influence public opinion. And then this is a completely uncharted territory. I mean, we're still talking about a transition to the digital age as if we're not 25 plus years into it. So I feel like I'm rolling my eyes all the time at these panel discussions about like journalism in the digital age and things like that. It's like, that's already happened. We're long here. And so if we're that behind in those discussions, you can imagine things like artificial intelligence and major social media companies now no longer being just in Silicon Valley, but in places like China, how we're very behind and we don't necessarily know what's going on and what the implications are. China's foreign ministry has said that it has not and will never ask companies to collect and store data illegally. Again, I guess it just depends on whether or not you trust that, right? And when there's not full cooperation into any potential probes into this, again, we're back to kind of these age-old suspicions where one party can claim it's xenophobia and another party could claim that there are legitimate concerns there. You know, with South Korea, it's interesting. I think South Korea tends to be a bit more embracing of technologies. For instance, ChatGPT, I think, is used here without much criticism or question compared to in the United States. I think people are still kind of proudly declaring if they don't use AI or they don't know about AI or they don't use ChatGPT, whereas I feel like South Koreans culturally are a little bit more of early adopters of these kind of technologies. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think in general, back to our talk about SIM swapping, I really encourage people to look at neutral information and decide from there, because I think a lot of this conversation with pundits can often be crowded, where people have their own agendas for promoting these kinds of things. And really, people should make decisions for themselves about the kinds of risks that they're willing to take.
Right, for sure, Kelly. Kelly, let's move on to another story of national interest. Now, with the presidential election about a month away, rival political parties have been floating around a number of potential policies to garner greater voter support now, including one about the potential adoption of a shorter work week. What's the latest on that front?
Yeah, it's interesting. So again, we're dealing with a snap election where one party, the party in which the impeached president was presiding over, did not have a clear candidate. And so it kind of reminds me, for people who are watching outside of South Korea, in the context of when President Biden said that he was not running for re-election, and suddenly we were kind of introduced to Vice President Harris as a candidate. I think South Korea, the candidates at play are really trying to appeal to voters and really create an identity around issues that average South Korean people really care about. One of those issues is work-life balance. South Korea infamously has a problem with this. South Korea also has a tragically low birth rate that is a serious threat to its economy, the future of the Korean people, even, and its identity as a nation. And so when you're dealing with a country where a lot of people are saying they're not having children because they don't feel like they have the time, or because they're afraid that their company will somehow punish them for taking the time off, or that people already feel like it's hard enough managing their work lives, there's big implications to these issues, is what I'm trying to say. So both the People Power Party, which is the more right-leaning party, and Minjudang, the Democratic Party, which is the more left-leaning party, are kind of floating ideas of something like a 4-day work week. From my understanding, the PPP is floating the idea of a 4.5-day work week. So the idea is that you can be flexible, like you can take a Friday afternoon off if you want, but you're still working, the full number of hours. And I think this is also trying to appeal to the businesses that don't want necessarily their workers in the office less. The issue or the drawback of that is that they're also talking about about getting rid of the 52-hour work week cap, which is something that Moon Jae-in, who's more on the left side, the Democratic Party president of the past, that was a big feat of his administration, was getting the 52-hour work week in place. Before that, the cap was 68 hours per week, and there certainly were a lot of people working like that, and probably not very productively, by the way. So that's kind of the PPP proposal. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has been saying more like a 4-day work week. And there are small pilot programs at individual offices or, districts or certain areas. But there's plenty of literature out there in the rest of the world, particularly Europe, Nordic countries, on the topic of the 4-day work week. But I think this is one way to kind of pander to voters. And we'll have to see if it actually takes place. One thing that I've observed with Korean labor law feats in general is that just because something's written on paper as a right does not necessarily mean that culturally it's going to be adopted in the workplace, partly because the onus is on the worker to raise their hand and say, this is my legal right, and I know this makes me look bad to my boss, but I want to take menstrual leave or something like that. And so we're seeing lower adoptions of things like paternity leave, unpaid menstrual leave, things that are protections, because there's kind of this cultural resistance to standing out for that. And so even though a 4-day work week may be adopted, I'd be interested to see how many people actually work less after that.
Well, we have Marc with us. So Marc, what would be the key variables in adopting a 4-day work week from a legal perspective?
So legally speaking, we do not actually have any wording or expression like 5-day work week or 6-day work week in the law. The Labor Standards Act just has a requirement to keep weekly working hours to 40 or less. The actual phrase is that you cannot exceed 40 hours per week for regular working hours. It is considered a 5-day work week because we normally have 8 hours per day for work. So 40 divided by 8 is 5, so you have 5-hour work week. If you look at the history, we started with the 48 hours per week. And then in 1989, the working hours changed to 44 hours per week, so 5.5-day work week. And in 2002, the government started to adopt 5-day work week in a few divisions within the government as a pilot program. And then mainstream banks adopted the 5-day work week in agreement between the companies and the labor unions. Then the government revised the Labor Standards Act in 2003 to reduce the statutory standards to 40 hours per week. In order to facilitate the process, the government adopted the 4-day week for a 5-day week for workplaces with 10,000 or more employees first, and to schools, and then finally expanded to all workplaces with five or more employees in 2011. So it took almost a decade to fully adopt the 5-day work week. So now to adopt the 4-day work week, the first approach will be just to encourage companies to adopt the 4-day work week. If the employers are willing to adopt the 4-day work week, they can agree on terms with the employees or the labor union and revise the collective bargaining agreement or the rules of employment, or 취업규칙 in Korean. It is always possible to raise the welfare of employees higher than the statutory standards. So this voluntary approach will come first. If this happens, it would be likely that they start with the 4.5 days per week by working 36 hours per week, and then move on to 4 days and 32 hours per week. Few companies are already adopting 4.5-day work week, but some companies rolled the program back. And the second approach will be revising the Labor Standards Act to lower the regular working hours to 36 and finally to 32 hours per week. This will likely be a gradual approach as we've been seeing in the past. But to do this, we need to overcome many obstacles because they need to solve questions like what will happen to the wages. They're going to lower the wages or they're going to keep it the same. And also the number of annual leaves and so on. And also, we're going to have the discrepancy between big companies and small-sized companies. So it will take a long time.
Right, I see. But hopefully it will be implemented in the near future if possible. Marc, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Kelly here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right,
thank you very much.
On that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching and be sure to join us again tomorrow.